Hey, it's Snake. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. Check out part 1 for the hardware portion and how to properly set up your mic. This guide is designed so that anyone with any background can learn how to record audio. There's a lot that goes into sound design, so this is a very general guide with resources where you can learn more about specific tweaks. Like the previous part, everything here can be used for recording sounds, voice work, streaming, music, and more. For music, you'll want to do more research because there's a lot more you'll need to do. Maybe I'll get my guitar and bass and do a video on it in the future. The software I'm going to be using is Cakewalk, but you can follow along with any digital audio workstation since most of these have all these features. Cakewalk is free, and the best way I can describe it is that it's the blender of audio engineering. Everything here can be used in Ableton, FL Studio, LMMS, Reaper, I don't know what I'm missing, but stuff like that. Audacity is also a good option, but it's more limited in what you can do. I personally only use Audacity for general recordings such as the audio for this guide, which is what I'm speaking right now, this take. And I show how to use it for that in the last part. For guitar, bass, etc., I record directly into Cakewalk. Because I covered this in the last part, I'm going to be a little brief. Record your sound source or voice 6 to 12 inches away from the microphone. If it's too loud or quiet, change your sensitivity. Sometimes you might already have a sound you want to use from a different software or downloaded a sound online. For the best results, import the WAV or FLAC version of that sound to maintain the best audio quality. You'll want those file types because they're quote-unquote lossless, and that means it's as pure of a sound as you can get. Importing MP3 files isn't recommended because you're dealing with lesser audio quality, and it's harder to work with as a result. This will import the sound into the track, and a track is a channel layer that interprets the sound with its own properties. I can best compare a track to a layer in an image or video editing software. Any sound in the same track will share the same properties. Now that you have your sound in your DAW, it's time to clean it up. Cut out any empty parts in the track, but be careful not to cut out parts of the sound. You'll want to be as precise as you can to get rid of any excess noise. When it comes to adding effects, it can be very situational. Depending on what you want for your sound, you may or may not be doing everything in these steps. Not every audio track needs all these steps, but it's good to tweak these in case the audio sounds better. Out of all of what I'm going to talk about, you'll most likely only need EQ and compression for general work, but it's good to know about these other tools at your disposal. You might seize the gain knob and wonder why it adjusts volume even though there is a volume slider. That's because gain and volume control how loud the sound is at different stages. Gain controls the raw sound before any effects are applied, and volume adjusts how loud the sound is after all effects are added. You most likely will not need to touch this. The pan knob determines which side of the headphones your sound will be more dominant in. For sounds and vocals, you don't want to change this. This setting is usually for music production, so you most likely not need to touch this. Equalization may seem a bit confusing at first, but think of it as volume at different frequencies. Out of all these effects, EQ is one of the most important. You don't want to adjust the EQ because certain frequencies for certain sounds just don't sound good, especially when combined with other sounds or background music. I need to clarify that each sound is unique, so how you EQ audio is also unique. EQ is something you need to feel in your ears in order to get it right. However, there are general guidelines all sounds follow for EQ. This UI might look confusing, but think of sound as a 2D space. Those light gray waves display what sound looks like. Frequencies, measured in hertz, is the space and pitch in which a sound occupies. The volume, denoted as decibels, measures how much that sound takes up a frequency. When you have multiple sounds, they can occupy the same frequency, but too many sounds can make the overall mix muddy. Also, keep in mind that volume is logarithmic, so the jump between 1 to 2 decibels is far less than the jump between 100 and 101 decibels. No matter what sounds you use or record, there's going to be unheard low-end sounds, so apply a high-pass filter. This will help additional audio effects that may amplify these sounds, such as reverb or compression. This filter is usually applied around the 40 to 70 Hz range. If your sound is heard while background music is playing, then it won't occupy the bass space in that background music. If you want to add a little clarity to your sound, you can boost the higher frequencies or add something like a shelf to add that sparkle. Unlike the high-pass filter, you don't always have to do this, and it might hinder your sound if you do this all the time. You'll have to use good judgment. Because of how unique sound is, I highly recommend the guide Musician on a Mission Approach Equalization 2 Types EQ to learn the vocabulary and what to look for when adjusting the frequencies in EQ. I'd explain it myself, but this guide I linked is the most condensed guide possible for EQ. This guide explains EQ better than I could, and I've been messing around with this stuff since 2018. Out of everything in that guide though, I recommend cutting first, then boosting, so in that way you're creating space for other sounds, whether it be another track in your DAW or other sounds in background music or in your projects or games. Again, this is something you're most likely going to have to feel because every sound is different, and it is important to feel to learn because EQ is the most important step for sound design. However, you can get this feel yourself by taking one of the points on the EQ graph and moving it around while a track is playing. Literally, just go nuts. Treat the node like a Gmod prop. There sometimes might be a sound that feels too quiet but also gets too loud at the same time. Sometimes maybe one or the other. Compression is a fix for that. It boosts the quiet parts of a sound while also quieting loud parts of your sound that go into the red. What I mean by this is that look at your track bus volume and press play. The volume light can turn red. That means your audio is close to or is clipping, and it reduces the audio quality by blending these loud frequencies with more quieter ones. With most default compression settings, you'll be fine just to slap it on. If not, there are guides available telling you everything about compression. This is also an important effect. Sometimes you'll need to use this, but you'll know when you'll need to just by looking at the volume output. You might want that extra bleed that Reverb can provide, but this can be very easy to abuse. Exhibit A, I probably used it earlier in this video. Slapped it on. I don't know right now because I'm currently recording. It might sound good on its own, but it also might muddy when compounded with other sounds. Reverb is best done subtly. It amplifies higher frequencies, and higher frequencies can sometimes be easier to pick up by the ear. There are times though you might want to use more reverb though, such as a cavern or an underwater effect. When done right though, it can make your sound feel bigger and take precedence over other sounds. Delay is pretty much an echo effect, so it's very situational for when you'll need to use this. Automation can be used to change the values of any effect while the track is playing, so it's very powerful and very useful. You'll most commonly use this for something like volume, either to make a sound initially quieter than louder, or you may use this to remove excess noise or click sound certain tracks can do while merging two tracks with two different audio levels. You'll know when you hear this.
Tip: to make a sound feel bigger, set the volume automation to be quieter at the beginning. In music theory, a crescendo has more impact to a loud sound. Tip number 2: you can use automation to remove excess noise.
When your sound is exactly how you want it, export it in the file format of your choosing and use it in your projects. When exporting, ensure the master volume doesn't go red. The yellow light can best be described as just right, but below it when it's green is acceptable. It's always easier to turn up the sound's volume later in the project's pipeline than if it's too loud. When exporting, I recommend exporting both an MP3 compressed and WAV uncompressed file of each recording. It's good to have both, even though you most likely want to use WAV whenever possible. Most game engines and video editing software compresses the sound anyways, and using an MP3 compresses the compression. Double compression. However, the bright side of using an MP3 is that it keeps your overall projects and game files much smaller. There are also occasional times where WAV is incompatible, and MP3 is typically very universal. The huge problem with WAV though is that this format can be significantly larger in file size. If worse comes to worse, you can convert an uncompressed format like WAV to a compressed one like MP3. If none of what I'm saying makes any sense, I'll share how I do my process so that you can follow along and get a good idea of what I do. I'll start by importing this 308 gunfire, and I'll play the sound and then trim out any of the excess empty space. Right about here is where the sound ends, so I'm going to play it just to confirm, and then trim this part out. The gunshot sounds a little thin compared to hearing it in real life, so it could go for a little more impact. For this to happen, I'm going to view the EQ by double-clicking on the EQ graph. In Cakewalk, this is the track bus under the console tab. Once opened, click on the power button on the top right of the window so that it is white. We can now see what this sound looks like when playing the track back. We can barely hear frequencies to the left of the 50 Hz line, so we're going to completely remove it with a high pass filter. and crank the slope up to 48. There are going to be times where this filter's frequency may be adjusted, such as a higher pitch or sound or a lower pitch sound, but we don't need to in this case. As you can see, there's still some here, but it helps out a lot either way. Next, we're going to reduce all of the harsh frequencies, and we reduce first because it's easier to isolate these frequencies before any frequency is boosted. To do this, I'm going to take an EQ node. Usually I do the high mid right here, and boost the gain at different frequencies. Okay, so now we know where we don't want the sound to be as prominent. And now we're going to reduce by a few decibels around the high mid because that's kind of where it's harsh. I'm going to reduce it by about 2.4, maybe a little bit more. Let's say 2.8. And let's move it back a little bit more here because that's where I'm hearing most of the bad sound. We don't want to reduce this too much, like say more than -6, because volume is logarithmic. And there are some harmonics still present that I want in this frequency. Completely reducing the gain will make the sound quote-unquote hollow. As you can hear, that's a little bit, that's like way too much. It really carves up the sound. So I'm going to set this back to -2.9. And there we go. Also, don't forget to save your work. You never know when it's going to crash. I'm also going to play around with the higher frequencies that can give the sound a brighter feel. To cover all this range, I'm selecting the shelf mode on the high EQ node, which is right here in Cakewalk. This is all being clumped by that shelf because it doesn't really matter if we isolate above 5 kilohertz. And our sound is mostly going to be in the lower end spectrum. We're not going to add a low pass filter because the human ear can hear all of that range, albeit very subtly. Although you could say the same thing with the low pass, the difference here is that you can't hear the difference on lower frequencies. There are times where you also need that high pass, but by adding it in this case, it can make the gunshot sound muffled. So we're going to leave it at about -2.3 on a shelf. If I do it up here, it sounds a little bit brighter, sounds a little bit harsher, but we want more of that boom. So we're going to lower it down here. Since I now cut what I wanted, it's time to boost frequencies that can give the impact to this sound. I'm going to start with the low end because this is where I assume the boom is going to be. So I'm going to raise this to about 6 decibels around that, around the 150 range. This might not sound noticeable at first, but side by side you can really hear the difference. So I'm going to turn it off. And then I'm going to turn the EQ back on. Much better, much boomier. Sometimes subtlety is key. And the only node that's left is the low mid. I'm going to raise it by about 12 decibels just to see what it sounds like. Maybe I need a boost, maybe I need to cut it. And I'm hearing right here is where the initial boom is. So I'm going to lower the decibel, or lower the gain to around 2.9 to around 3. And I'm going to go play it back. With it on. With it off. Now to make sure that this is loud enough, I'm going to play it back again and make sure that the volume does not go above the red. And it stays in the yellow. You can see on either the audio bus that this is in or the master track. And it's perfect. At this point, the sound doesn't need anything else, so now it is time to export. For my game, I'm going to export this as an MP3, and I'm also going to export it as a WAV. So in that way I have the full sound in its uncompressed form. The best practice is to use WAV for your projects, but I'm using MP3 because my game is retro. Most game engines and video editing software compresses the sound anyways, and using an MP3 compresses the compression. However, the bright side of using an MP3 is that it keeps your overall project's in-game file sizes smaller. Coming up with sounds for your project or game might be the hardest challenge for some people. There's really no right or wrong way to get these ideas, but here's a good creative exercise I use to get started. Go about your day and think of the sounds you hear. This could be as obvious as opening a door or something as obscure as a footstep. Also, take the time to play some games, listen to their sound design, and take notes on what details make these sounds fit. For example, UI can be very percussive, while something like a platformer jump raises in pitch over time. Both real-world and in-game studies can be combined by drawing similarities between the two. I recommend researching Foleys for realistic sounds, and for more artificial sounds, play around in your DAW, download instruments, and more. The second part of that will allow you to be much more comfortable in the software environment that you're using. This is as condensed as a guide I can get while also sharing how I tweak my sounds personally. This sound I edited is planned to be used in Soldier's Descent, the turn-based RPG with shooter elements. If you want to see more content like this, like, comment, follow on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, join the Discord. If you're into audio as much as I am, please leave a comment because that might help others, it might help me learn, and it would benefit everyone. Thank you and have a great day. Rock on.